I wonder if you can just start by introducing yourself to the camera.
Yeah. Well, my name's John Bulmer and I'm a photographer. I was brought up in Hereford.
When did you first pick up a camera, John?
I first became interested in photography as a sort of one of a series of childhood crazes that a lot of kids used to have in those days. It was before the days when television was around much and no computers or anything. And I played with Meccano and toy trains and carpentry and things like that. And then someone gave me a box brownie. And I started off really being fascinated by the mechanics of it, you know, the business of creating an image. And then I got obsessed with making prints in a darkroom, and I built my own enlarger out of some tin cans and Meccano and things like that. So it started off really as a mechanical thing, and then I became fascinated by the business of making images. It was a strange time because there was not a lot of good photography around in Britain at that time. The Picture Post had died in the sort of later part of the 50s, and there was not a picture magazine in England. The newspapers ran fairly average sort of photographs. There was not much excitement about them. But I did manage to sort of see things like Life magazine, and then an exhibition came along which was in London. I didn't see that, but I saw the book called The Family of Man. And compared to the very static sort of pictures one saw at exhibitions, this was an eye-opener. It was really wonderful because it was about real life rather than being a sort of static thing. And so that suddenly made me realise that there was a whole world out there of exciting photographs.
So when did you first encounter Derek Evans?
Well, there was a time when I'd been away at boarding school, and there was a time when I came back to do the sixth form at the Hereford Cathedral School, and I kind of wandered into Derek's studio because I heard there was a local photographer, and by that time I was quite keen on photography, and I really felt that I wanted to be a photographer, although it wasn't a career that had much prospect in most people's terms. But Derek was a breath of fresh air compared to most local photographers, because he was much more capable, and so it was great to meet him.
So you walked across Cathedral Green and walked into his studio on Broad Street?
I imagine so. I mean, I do remember he was right close by, and I remember meeting him in those days, and I used to wander in, and Derek was always ready for a chat. He could talk the hind leg off the donkey, as you've probably heard from lots of people. But he was either chatting or working in the darkroom, and he was happy to have one come in and chat while he worked in the darkroom, smoking like a chimney all the time. I mean, ash was dropping into the chemicals. It's amazing that it didn't seem to affect his pictures too much. But he was quite a dynamo, and he was like a breath of fresh air in those days.
So you were this young lad, 16 or 17-year-old. Did he teach you a lot?
I did learn a lot from Derek because his approach was very direct and go get it. He threw the papers into the chemicals and sloshed them around, and it wasn't precious in any way. He just went out and did it, and it was a good basic training. I felt he taught me a lot in that respect. Whereas the people you met at camera clubs were far too tentative and slow and unoriginal, and Derek just got on and did it. So that was quite good for a young person.
What was his reaction to you, this young boy walking in? Did you express an interest in photography?
I did, and his actions speak stronger than words, and the fact was he gave me a job in the school holidays, so that was a very practical thing that was my baptism by fire, really.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I understand there's a News of the World story that you were telling us about.
Yes, I think the first time he hired me for a couple of weeks, and I think what I hadn't realised was the first day I was in the office, he went off to Belgium, I think it was, on some job, and left me in charge of the office. And the first thing that happened was the News of the World rang because they had some expose story about a vicar in Hereford who's living with his housekeeper, in sin, of course. And this reporter from the News of the World came down, and I had to go out him and hide in the bushes and grab a picture of this unfortunate vicar as he came to the door to answer to the journalists. And then there were another series of stories about girls who claimed virgin birth. And this was quite popular in the late 50s, some people actually believed it in some extraordinary way, and whether they believed it or not, it still made a good story. So there was all kinds of sort of nonsense like that, but it was a good combat training, because the thing about working on a newspaper that's very different from doing the more amateurish photography is you only get one chance and you have to go out and do it. And although Derek, unfortunately, he had to do his share of the boring pictures of the mayor shaking hands with all kinds of people, there were a few real stories, despite the poor taste of some of them. There were real stories where things were happening and you had to grab it.
Did it have the sense then that it was a proper news agency in a way, the studio, was it?
Yes, because although he did quite a lot of local work, he was the stringer for most of the national newspapers in Hereford. And if any national paper had a story in Hereford that was either it was too short notice or they didn't have time to send their own photographer, then they would ring up Derek. He was their stringer, so that one was working effectively for national newspapers.
Do you remember the photograph you took of the vicar and his mistress?
Well, I never saw the mistress, I'm glad to say, but I do remember the picture of the vicar, because it was rather underexposed. It was a bit dark, and we struggled a bit. I remember struggling in the darkroom to get enough of an image out of it, but I think it was run in the News of the World, or whichever. I think it was that dreadful paper.
Do you remember what Derek thought about it?
I don't. I mean, I think by the time he got back, it had been in the newspaper, and he got paid, and so he was happy enough. I didn't get any adverse comments anyway.
John, can you describe the studio for us, the Derek Evans studio?
Well, I remember Derek Evans' studio was I think it was up on the second or the third floor. I remember climbing a lot of stairs, and then I remember walking into an office that was absolutely thick with smoke, because he smoked like a chimney. And off that was the darkroom, which was fairly dimly lit. But I do remember that he used to, mostly we had a developer tray and a stop bath and a fixer, and he used to throw them straight from the developer into the fixer without using a stop bath, and he used to smoke heavily, and the ash would drop into the dish with the developer. But it didn't seem to matter. I mean, he did produce good prints, so he was quite gung-ho, and it used to work. So I just remember really these two rooms, the office and the darkroom, high up in the office.
And what was the atmosphere like there? Were there other young photographers like you?
There weren't other young photographers, no, but quite often people did used to wander in and out who were buying prints or had stories. And there was one girl who I remember rather liking, who came in and actually did some work for him too, called Jennifer Bowen, whose son is a very good Middle Eastern correspondent. And so it was nice when she was around, and it was a good time.
Did you ever go out on, assignments with Derek?
Occasionally, but not much really. I think because mostly, I was there because he needed somebody to go out and do things. But I did sometimes go out, or sometimes man the office. So it was a mixture of things, really.
Can you remember any of those missions out to get a photograph? Any stand out in your mind?
Well, apart from this News of the World one for the vicar and his housekeeper, I don't remember a lot of them. I remember going out to photograph floods with Jennifer once, and she got stuck in the flood with a rather old van that she used to drive. And I remember trying to get her out of the floodwaters. But I don't really remember many other details of stories.
What sort of camera were you using in those days?
I remember using a mixture of cameras. I remember once using an old plate camera to photograph a football match, and that was a real struggle because I'd never used one of those before. But otherwise, I think I used a Rolleiflex mostly, which was a camera that I haven't used a lot since. I didn't really like them much because they produce square pictures, but they were quite good for those kind of news photographs because you would capture a large area and then you could crop and blow up something within them. But Derek did use he used a Linhof plate camera quite a lot in those days, a small Linhof plate camera, which was, it was quite portable and good for a plate camera, but I really didn't like plate cameras. I was in a slightly different world in that I was looking to be like Cartier-Bresson, who used a Leica, whereas Derek was more of a sort of local news photographer who was using a bigger format, which I do see as practical for what he was doing.
So did you, I was talking to his last apprentice recently, who said that one of the biggest lessons he learned from Derek was, Derek used to say to him, he would go in and say, I have a story, and Derek would say, well, you've got 30 seconds, tell me the story. And you can't tell me the story in 30 seconds, you haven't got a story. Did you learn that sort of thing from him, or was it the mechanics of photography or the composition?
Well, the strange thing is, although Derek was a great talker, when it came to the picture, he got on and did it. There was no messing around. And so one thing I did learn was that a news photographer doesn't have two chances. You get on and you do it.
Has that been a good training ground for your subsequent career?
It certainly was a good starting point, but as I think you know, I went to work for the Daily Express for over a year as a news photographer, and that was as good a combat training as one can get in the business, I think. And I've used that experience even in filmmaking and things, that when you see something, when something happens, you have to be ready for it and you have to be able to capture it there and then. There's no good asking for people to recreate things. It doesn't work for me. And in television, that was quite a change because when I went into filmmaking, most television was very set up and very static. And most things were based on interviews, and the images were very unadventurous, whereas I approached it from a different angle, more like news filming, and I wanted things to be real and as they were.
When you were at Derek's studio, were there other comparative photographers in the city working the same scene? What was the photographic scene like in the city?
Hereford was very much a small town, and Derek was the only real stringer for national newspapers. There were other local photographers who, there were wedding photographers, there were Hereford Times photographers, and there were people who did sort of commercial things, but there was nobody else really who was on the national newspaper level. And that was definitely a step above the local photography level. Derek was very good at that sort of thing. He wasn't what I would call an international photographer. He was certainly not a Cartier-Bresson, but he made things out of what he saw in Hereford that were above the level of other local photographers, without question.
So had you singled him out then when you decided you wanted to do photography? It was Derek Evans you went to, nobody else? You hadn't approached anyone else?
I don't remember thinking about that. I don't think there was anybody else in Hereford who could have taught me anything really at that stage. He was streaks ahead of the other local photographers.
What did your parents think about you going there?
My parents were...
You were all up for a career, weren't you, at Cambridge for engineering? And
my parents expected me to study for engineering and go into the cider business. And when I showed an interest in photography, they certainly weren't against that. But when it looked like a career choice, they were understandably a little nervous. And their attitude, which was fair, was, well, go to Cambridge and get yourself a degree, and then you can decide later. But the interesting thing was that there really wasn't, there were not big opportunities as a photographer in my book at that stage, because I would not have been happy to be a photographer in Hereford. I wanted to, travel the world and do things on a more serious level. And it wasn't until I got to Cambridge and met photographers who were working for people like Magnum or Life magazine that I realised there really was a world out there, that it was possible to travel the world and make a living out of photographs.
Do you remember are there any particular characters from that time, John, that you remember that maybe came into the studio or you met during your travels as a photographer in the city and county?
I don't think there are really. I was thinking of the other day, and it was a long time ago, and it didn't go on for very long. But I don't think I do really. Sorry about that. That's a negative one.
That's all right. Did you ever take photographs of the city's Mayfair?
Yes, in fact, the Mayfair, that was the first photograph I ever had published anywhere. I took for the Hereford. I sold to the Hereford Times a picture of someone in a bumper car, and I remember they paid me 5 shillings for it, old money, and that was the first money I ever made from selling a photograph.
How old would you have been?
16 or something, I think. Something around that.
What about, did you ever go out to the hop fields and take pictures there?
I didn't, no. I remember going to the hop fields. I remember when I was a child, we sometimes went as a family and picked hops for a day or something like that, just for fun. But I don't remember actually taking photographs of that. And I don't know really why that was. I do remember Derek's photographs of hop pickers, and of course they're up in the records office, quite a lot of them. But I didn't really take pictures of that myself.
And football, were you a football fan? Did you ever take pictures of Hereford United?
Well, Derek sent me to photograph a football match there once, and that was the only time I ever used the old plate camera. And I remember that was extraordinary because it was a 5x4 VN plate camera, and it didn't have shutter speeds and things like that, or stops, but you had to set the tension on the shutter and the gap, and you would set it something like a quarter inch gap, and the pressure of numbers was something like number 6, and then you'd have to set the aperture of the size of a pencil, and it was just done by guesswork in that way. You didn't have exposure meters and stops and things for that. So that was quite scary, but it worked, but it wasn't really. I was never really interested in football.
But were you, excuse me, were you pitch side? Were you having to run up and down the line? I mean, how did you do it?
Well, I took a position near the goal on one side and waited for things to happen in that area, because the problem was the focusing was very slow and difficult, and you didn't have automatic focus cameras, obviously, so you had to pre-focus by guesswork on one particular bit of ground and really wait for people to come into that area. So it was very hit and miss.
What about the Heart of Oak Flower Festival in Fownhope? Did you ever go there?
No, I didn't actually. I don't remember that particularly.
Well, in I think it was 1958, Derek was publicity man for Frank Owens.
That's right.
Were you around then?
I remember him talking a lot about Frank Owen, but I don't actually remember seeing them together. I do remember Derek taking some pictures. I think when Prince Philip came to the factory, the Bulmer cider factory, and the mayor of Hereford was weighed in cider, and I remember seeing his pictures from that. Derek also actually, a little later this was, he took a wonderful photograph of my father riding a penny farthing bicycle, which is a great picture, and I'm surprised they didn't have that on show in the records office, because it was, to me, one of his best photographs.
It's probably not been catalogued yet.
We've seen that actually. Yes, yes. Oh, that's good to know that it's your father actually.
So, John, was it you arrived at Derek Evans' studio? You were 16 or 17. You had a car. You had a camera. Was it quite a dashing thing to be doing then?
In those days, I didn't think of myself as dashing or anything like that. I was just interested in subjects, and the whole business of being a photographer was not. it wasn't a celebrity business in those days. I mean, this was long before Lord Snowdon married Princess Margaret. So being a photographer wasn't, I mean, it was a bit like a lady being an actress in the 19th century, I think. It wasn't far above prostitution. So, I mean, that's perhaps a bit extreme, but there was no status in being a photographer really in those days. And that happened a lot later. So that I didn't think of it as a sort of status thing to do, but it was something that I was passionate about.
But where did that come from?
Fashion?
The passion.
The passion.
Because your family are the Bulmers. I mean, I imagine you were destined for a career in the family business. So where did that passion come from?
Well, I think I really hated boarding school. I think that, the boarding school was to do about being good at games and rugger and all that sort of thing, and I wasn't that kind of person. I didn't thrive in that boarding school situation. So I think that something that I found that was my own was something that mattered to me. And I think it was just a question of finding something that I could do that was my own and I was passionate about. And I think that's the same with most kids. They want to find something that they can feel good at.
And so I get the sense there was a real hierarchy amongst the photography business in the city at the time, and that maybe Derek Evans' studio was at the top?
Derek Evans was certainly, in my book, way the best photographer in Herefordshire or around the location. I wasn't comparing him to Cartier-Bresson, but he was a live wire and he was doing something exciting and interesting in my book. And it was a completely different thing from the local Hereford Times photographer.
What did your schoolmasters think about you popping over there and working?
I don't think that my teachers at the school had any idea what I was doing, and it wasn't until later when I was at Cambridge that it became obvious that I was spending rather a long time on extracurricular activities and ultimately got myself into trouble there and got thrown out.
So tell us a bit about that then. So you left the cathedral school and you were accepted at Cambridge to do engineering.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a bit about that and what happened?
Well, I went off as was planned to study engineering at Cambridge, and right from the start I spent a lot more time taking photographs than I probably should have done and a lot less time studying engineering. And I remember the first week I was there, I photographed the student rag and I took a picture of the police arresting somebody and that ran a big spread, and the police chased me, but fortunately I got away. And from then on, really, I was involved a huge amount with the university newspaper to start with, and then with a picture magazine that I was one of the co-founders of. And in addition to that, I started doing work for the Daily Express in London and for magazines whilst I was at Cambridge.
But how did that come about? How did you get your first gig with Daily Express?
Well, the first picture with Daily Express, I think it was simply that I saw something in Cambridge that was newsworthy and sent it to them. And after that, when something happened that was in the university rather than in the city, instead of ringing up their stringer they had in the town, they rang me because I had a connection within the university that the town people didn't have. So that I really became the unofficial stringer for the Express in Cambridge University.
And then, so did your university career continue?
My university career came to rather an abrupt end, only about 6 weeks before my final exams, because I did a story on the night climbers of Cambridge. That's the students who climbed the buildings at night. And unfortunately, right at the end of the spring term, I was trying to photograph one of the students jumping from Keyes College to the Senate House. It's called the Senate House Leap, and it's quite a dangerous thing to do. And I'd never asked them to do it, but one night, it was actually just before Christmas, one of the students came to me and said, "Look, we're thinking of taking a look at the leap tonight. Do you want to come?" And I said, "Of course." And I was in the alley down below with a camera and a flash gun, and the student was up at the top. And somebody must have tipped off the police because they turned up and they grabbed me. And the police didn't arrest students in those days. They handed them over to the university police, or the proctors as they're called. And so I was hauled up before the proctors. And I kind of denied all involvement. I said I claimed to be a passerby, and long and short of it is I kind of got away with it, I thought. But around the same time, the Sunday Times ran a big picture of somebody climbing the window of King's Chapel that I'd taken, and although I didn't put my name on it, they kind of pinned it on me a bit. And the long and short of it is they decided to throw me out, although they hadn't quite pinned it on me, but they said I'd spent too much time taking photographs and that I would probably fail my finals. So I was finally thrown out just before my end exams.
So did you, excuse me, you know, the eye for a picture, there's the composition, but also knowing what makes a good story, what might distort what picture paper might buy. Was that something you had gleaned from your time with the Derek Evans studio, or was that something you developed?
I think the knowledge of what makes a good picture is, you know, to me, whether you're working in journalism for a paper or just for an exhibition wall or for anything, a picture has to, I've always felt a picture needs to kind of hit you in the gut a little bit. It has to be something about it that matters. I mean, I wouldn't want to go and take a picture of something that was entirely boring, because however good a picture it was, it's still going to be boring. So the most important thing before you start is to find a subject that's interesting. And obviously I learnt at Derek Evans quite a bit about what newspapers wanted, and that I kind of worked on through my time at Cambridge with the university magazine and newspaper, and then for magazines. In fact, when I left Cambridge, I did go on trying to work for magazines as well as the Daily Express, and the key was to take them a story to look at that was something they were interested in. There's no point taking them something that would be entirely boring to them. So it's always the same. You have to find a story that's interesting enough to whet their appetite, and then on top of that, it has to be good pictures.
So John, if you were starting out now as a 15 and 16-year-old in 2016, what sort of advice would you give?
Well, obviously the challenge of photography is quite different in many ways now from what it was 50 years ago. The cameras are much easier to use. There isn't the technical knowledge you need to have, because anybody can take a picture nowadays. It also goes without saying that because so many people can take pictures, it's harder to sell them in a way, and it's harder to make a living out of it. But the same rules apply. I mean, I always say to students that the fact that digital cameras make life easier, you should use that to your advantage, because it means you don't have to worry about technical things, and you can use 100% of your efforts in your brain and your eyes into making a good image. So I'm not one of those people who wants to put the clock back and go back and take pictures on film anymore. I think that's plain silly. But if you want to be a photographer, there are different ways in which you have to finance it now, because I was really lucky. I was paid to go around the world numerous times in the 1960s. Well, I don't think you wouldn't get that from a newspaper now, but you'd probably have to find some other way of making it happen. Photography, to be really good at anything, has always been difficult and always will be difficult, and that's not changed. It's just the methods have changed a bit, but it's still an exciting world out there.
Because you went on to have an amazing career, didn't you? At the Sunday Times, you were described as a pioneer in colour photojournalism. Then you had your film career. Could you tell us about that?
Which bit? The first bit?
All of it.
Right. Well,
you know, after Cambridge, Daily Express.
Yeah. After I was sent down from Cambridge, I started with the Daily Express, but I always knew that wasn't where I was planning to end up. I knew from my Cambridge days and from having met some photographers for Life magazine and things, and seeing what was going on in the world, that I knew by then that there was a world out there where one could have a serious career and travel the world. And also the status of photography was improving. I mean, in England, we were very class-ridden, and the fact that Lord Snowdon, or Tony Armstrong-Jones as he was called then, married Princess Margaret, suddenly gave a boost to the status of photography. I mean, you could be considered a serious person now. But I knew that it was international magazines that I wanted to work for. And I started with things like Town magazine and Queen magazine, which were very good magazines, but I was lucky that within a couple of years the Sunday Times started their first colour magazine. And what was strange was that within a few years it became the world's leading magazine for photojournalism. It was a time when most countries were having troubles with photojournalism. Life magazine was closing up, and the Sunday Times suddenly had become this amazing platform. And I was lucky that I was around at the right time, and I was young enough to be adaptable, and I was able to adapt to colour in a way that a lot of other photographers were not. I mean, for example, there were a number of people who'd worked for Picture Post in the 50s, and they were not really up to adapting to shooting in colour. They went out in my book and took black and white pictures with colour film in their cameras. And colour photography did require that you thought in a different way and made images that had that power. But the Sunday Times magazine really was the first magazine in the world to seriously use colour in photojournalism. As before that, colour had been used for fashion, for advertising, for holidays, but it hadn't been used for journalism in this sort of way. And even Life magazine in its last years tended to do their stories in black and white with occasional essays in colour on fashion or travel, but the meat of it was still black and white, and that was something that the Sunday Times really pioneered.
And then you went into film.
Well, by the early 70s, I'd been working for the Sunday Times magazine for over 10 years, and they began to have a bit of a problem, I think, which was that the advertisers were trying to sell lifestyle, and they were not really happy that the editorial contents of the magazine was so different. And I think I was working there, and Don McCullin was working there, and he did quite a lot of stories on Biafra and Vietnam and things. And I think that the advertisers became dissatisfied with the balance between the advertising and the editorial. So we had a new editor called Hunter Davis, and I remember he called me into his office one day and he said, "Right, what we're looking for now is stories on crime, middle-class living and fashion." And I knew my days were numbered. And I made a decision then to move sideways really into filmmaking, because there were a lot of reasons really. I found that as a still photographer, one was either travelling or one was unemployed, whereas filmmaking is a longer process. You're more involved with the people you're filming, and it has a beginning and a middle and an end. And I thought that it was an interesting area to move into. And I'm glad that I did this, because other photographers I know became rather corporate. They started doing company reports for advertising agencies and big business. And a lot of people in Magnum Agency, for example, I think did a lot of corporate work, and I wasn't happy doing that. It wasn't for me, really.
You know,
Sorry?
you walked into Derek's studio, and have you ever had anyone walk into your studio and then who you have mentored?
Yes, I've met a few young photographers, and I hope that I've helped some of them along on the way. I didn't really have a studio in the way that people would walk into my studio, and I was working out of a suitcase more, and so it was harder in that respect. I didn't have young people working for me because I was working on my own or with a writer normally. But I always want to think that it's good to encourage young people, and I think one can learn from young people too. I mean, photography's hugely changed nowadays, and some of it I like and some of it I don't, but that doesn't matter. One needs all kinds to make a world, and all kinds of photography keeps the thing fresh. So I think that, I don't want to be an old fogey in that sense.
Did you stay in touch with Derek?
I did see Derek on and off over the years, certainly, and not closely, but certainly now and again, and it was always fun to see him. He always had plenty. One didn't get a word in edgeways. He had plenty to say, but it was always good to see him.